Hello, I'm back to read the last and final section. It's 10 pages, and I thought it best to break it up. This is a book by Helen Cathcart, The Princess Royale, From Princess Mary to Prince Anne. It could be found on Audible if you got an Audible account. It's only one credit, and it's such a pleasant listen, and I really enjoyed reading about Princess Mary and Anne the most. So I really like to take time and read through every word. But it is such a wonderful read to listen to Princess Mary's story. It's not anything that I thought. She was so dedicated to her duty, and she trained to be a nurse during World War One. She was so wonderful. She had such a diplomatic and nice relationship even after the Duke of Windsor had abdicated. I think people judge their parents, George and Mary, so harshly, but they were so reserved and regal in nature. And they were young parents who had to assume the monarchy, very, very young during a very different time during World War One. George V changed the name from Saxe-Coburg to Windsor, and Mary was very beloved by both her parents. We're at the part where her husband, the Count Harewood, had died. She became the Countess of Harewood, and they had so much in common, and I don't know all of their history, but I think they had a good marriage, even though they were like 15 years apart. So the Princess Royale had discovered that she was no longer a stranger to anxiety and sorrow. I used to lead a sheltered life, she once confided to a friend, but one doesn't anymore. On the outbreak of war, her elder son, George, the seventh Earl, had not been old enough to join a regiment. He, in fact, went into action for the first time with the Grenadier Guards in Italy, and on his 21st birthday, and 4 months later, he was wounded by machine gun fire and taken prisoner. The date itself might have wounded a Snell to a worried mother, for it was the very day of which her husband had been wounded in France in the First World War, and his great grandfather wounded at Waterloo. The enemy classified her son as prominente, in effect, an important hostage whose life might be forfeit at any moment. It was a small wonder if for a time the Princess Royale suffered from sleeplessness. Her antidote for anxiety had been to involve herself still more deeply in public service. And in widowhood, she filled her engagement book for months beforehand with the same zealous urge, as if responding to her mother's calm words. One must go on. Once again, she began to widen her already considerable list of patronages and presidency, her offices of rank and her fellowship, from nursing and women's voluntary social work, agriculture and Yorkshire interest to a far wider field. When she agreed to become Chancellor of Leeds University, for instance, she was the first woman to be installed in such an appointment in Great Britain. In 1948, in her wish to carry on her husband's more personal enthusiasms, she registered her own racing colors, the first royal lady ever to do so, and the precedent enabled her niece, the then Princess Elizabeth, to register her own racing colors the following year. The Princess Royale had sponsored Elizabeth at her christening, little realizing that her goddaughter would one day be the Queen. Indeed, it was when the young princess was just 13 and was staying with the Harewoods at Egerton House, Newmarket, and she noticed the gilt scroll of royal winners under the arch of the stable yard, and perhaps first divined the scope of her own future racing interests. The Princess Royale's own racehorses seldom fulfilled her hopes for them, and most of the classic prizes eluded her. But she took a lively interest in her niece's successes. Meanwhile, she found herself entering a new phase as the Aunt Mary of the younger generation of royalty, and at about this time she became aware also that her two sons were developing firm romantic interests. The story has been often told of how Lord Harewood first saw his future wife. She was the pianist, Marion Stein, during an opera interval at Glyndebourne, and was introduced to her by Benjamin Britten at Alderburgh Festival the following year. He courted her during a tour at the Beggar's Opera, and proposed to her shortly after the curtain fall of another opera. There were certain difficulties. Lord Harewood was then the 10th in succession to the throne, while Mrs. Stein's father was a Viennese-born music publisher who had first come to Britain as a refugee. As a small house party near Amsterdam formed by the Steins, Lord Harewood, Benjamin Britten, Kathleen Farrer, and others, that engagement summer one guest detected a touch of apprehension. According to his close friend Ronald Duncan, the dramatist, Harewood occasionally looked worried. His uncle, King George VI, had not yet given permission. We knew that everything depended on Queen Mary's attitude. Yet the Princess Royale had come to hold decided opinions on her own post-war world, and her son had not faced death during the war without giving her a new sense of preciousness of life and its happiness. She brought the king around to her point of view and began to prepare the ground with her mother. But less persuasion was needed than she was expected. Lord Harewood returned from Amsterdam and hurried direct to see his grandmother at Marlborough House, and the engagement was announced just a few days later. At age 82, Queen Mary did not feel well enough to attend the September wedding. Every other member of the royal family was there, but the old lady was at the reception at St. James Palace. The story is told of the short-sighted author E.M. Forster, who asked if he had been presented to Queen Mary, and replied that he did not know she was there. The queenly figure in white seated near the middle of the room was pointed out to him. "Dear me," said Mr. Forster, "I thought that was the wedding cake." Okay, we're on to the last little section. And it is just about 4 pages long. So, with a new unaccustomed chat lane at Harewood House, the inevitable changes were made in perfect agreement. The great Adam Mansion, in any event, had confronted stern economic hazards after the death of Princess Mary's Royal's husband. When Goldsborough Hall and many estate farms had been sold to help pay death duties, Harewood had been open to the public, and the Dowager Countess, the Princess Royale, made her home in one wing, from which she sallied forth, rather like Betsy Trotwood, to retrieve rubbish dropped by the more thoughtless new-style visitors. Can you imagine that? She's a princess, she's a countess, and she's cleaning up the trash after visitors. In 1952, the marriage hopes of her second son, Gerald, then age 27, also freshly occupied her affectionate attention. The Duke of Windsor once said that Queen Mary, with her invincible virtue and correctness, looked out as from a fortress upon the rest of humanity. But Princess Royal had her mother's insight with more than her mother's sympathy. What did it matter if her future daughter-in-law, then Miss Angela Dowding, was an actress and a little older than Gerald? What seemed important was that Angela should be the right girl for her. Their happiness was obvious from the first meeting, and the princess found herself listening with intense amusement to stories of ENSA repertory tours, a Jack Hawkins company, entertaining groups in Italy, Egypt, India, Ceylon, and Burma. When the engagement was announced in the newspapers, uncovered the delectable morsel of gossip that the girl who was about to marry King George V's grandson had been born in a semi-detached house in a London suburb. But what a pity it was that they never disclosed the real reason. Angela's mother was a rooted dislike of hospitals and nursing homes, and hit upon the happy idea of staying in her midwife's little house during the confinement. After their wedding, the young couple set up their first home in a fashionable mews off Bayswater Road, a circumstance which the Princess Royal must also have reported to Queen Mary with great enjoyment. It was the very house, 21 Albine Mews, which served as a pub in Marjorie's shop novel, The Britannia Mews. For their second home, Gerald was led to his mother into an amusing adventure. On the verge of Windsor Great Park, there stood the Duke of Windsor's former bachelor home, the deserted Fort Belvedere. It was a grace and favor residence with the Queen had only recently told the Crown Commissioner that she no longer required it. The grounds were becoming a wilderness of bracken and brambles. In more than a dozen years of disuse, the house stood moldering in decay. Birch saplings rose from the cracks in the swimming pool. Beyond the front door was a nightmare of peeling wallpaper and falling plaster. Damp and mold disfigured bedrooms and drawing rooms. The Princess Royal had but to find out whether the Queen had any objection to Gerald as a tenant, and he was the first to volunteer to actively help in restoring the garden. For nearly 2 years, the regeneration of this dilapidated scene was one of her staple interests. Regardless of the battle scars, she helped disentangle rampant brambles from among the climbing roses and watched ever-changing vista of progress with delight. Gerald and Angela had one child, Henry, and named him after his grandfather, who was born in 1953, only 2 weeks before the coronation. This was the fourth crowning of close relatives, if we may include Maud of Norway, which Princess Mary had attended in her lifetime. For further commemoration, Marion, the Countess of Harewood, also presented Lord Harewood with a son, the second of her 3 boys in the coronation year. Queen Mary had lived to see only her first Lascelles grandson, but the Princess Royal found an extended phase of fulfillment in the new reign with fresh domestic patterns. The present author possesses a set of photographs of grandmama and grandsons at Harewood with a donkey she had given them. There are snapshots of the 4 boys with their bicycles and dogs, with the Princess Royale, a contented figure in the midst of this family activity. Other photographs show the princess's remarkable collection of owls in jade, or humble pottery, in ivory, metal, and porcelain, decked with semi-precious stones, which always made her birthday easy to commemorate. To repay one of her grandmother's gifts, a youngster had only to present her with an owl, which he might whittle himself from a block of wood, or find in a local shop, to add to her collection. and being closely associated with the city of Leeds, the princess was amused to discover an owl in the civic coat of arms. As patroness of the Embroiderers' Guild, she was once presented with an embroidered owl covered in jewels and sequins, and her dining table was decked with a set of owl mustard pots. But her breakfast table, however, was a rival bird, a porcelain parrot, a sentimental reminder of the parrot that had strutted out on her father's breakfast table at Sandringham so long ago. As a senior member of the royal family, Aunt Mary came to become more frequently consulted for her knowledge of precedents and associative details with the men that were so immense. When Prince Edward was born, the Queen asked her aunt to distribute the royal Maundy, a delicate compliment, for the Queen Mother was the only other woman to have acted as a deputy. An Abbey official who sought to instruct the Princess Royale on the ceremonial found of her fully familiar with it. "I've been reading it up," she explained, "to refresh my memory. It was at least 30 years since she had seen George V and Queen Mary play their part in the ritual. Shortly after the traditional royal attendance at the service had been revived after more than 2 centuries. The Princess Royale enjoyed undertaking the same tasks and responsibilities as the younger post-war princesses, disconcerting as she may have found some aspects of her world. I simply asked myself what my father and mother would have done, and she would say, to solve a dilemma, but the mind boggles and the thoughts of Queen Mary dancing with the president of an African republic on Independence Night, or a King George in a plane stacked above a fog-bound airport. The princess had never crossed the Atlantic until she visited the West Indies in 1953. 2 years later, when invited to Canada by the regiments of which she was the colonel-in-chief, the Canadian Scottish and the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals, she accepted so many extra engagements, and the initial arrangement spread into a coast-to-coast royal tour. Both these journeys were made by sea. She recalled her initial distrust of flying with amusement. A few years later, when she flew by the polar route to Canada in a Yukon aircraft of the Royal Canadian Air, on her 60th birthday in 1957, she found herself planning an official tour of Nigeria and agreeing to an itinerary that might have seemed arduous to someone 10 years younger. Reading it up so thoroughly beforehand, she knew more about Lagos and Kano than people who lived there. The princess made a dozen speeches in as many days. As I noted at the time, her duties included the inauguration of 2 legislatures on behalf of the Queen, opening new universities and factories, hospitals, and model marketplaces. Then in 1960 came her 3-month tour of the West Indies and British Honduras, originally intended as a recuperative cruise aboard the royal yacht Britannia. If only she would have made it so. This was followed in 1962 by her visit to preside over the independent ceremonies of Trinidad and Tobago, and the same year saw her tour of service units in the Mediterranean, with duty visits to Gibraltar, Cyprus, Tripoli, and Tobruk. The millions who thought of the Princess Royale as Yorkshire's princess scarcely knew of these activities. It was left to an American magazine to style her the anonymous ambassador. Was she attempting too much? In the autumn of 1964, she had no sooner returned from a month's tour of Newfoundland than she flew to Lusaka for a week of exacting functions for the independent ceremonies of the new state of Zambia. Okay, this was quite something. So she died the 1st of April, 1965. This is all that she's been doing. This is amazing. She lived to be 67. Okay. With all the tact he could muster, her equerry, Sir Geoffrey Eastwood, mentioned that the princess had never been afraid of hard work, but his subtle hints made little difference. Meanwhile, as early as 1963, she faced new problems in private life. She must have been seen with middle-age insight that difficulties had entered the Harewood marriage, and although her elder son and daughter-in-law attempted to spare her from their emotional turmoil, it was later said it was thought to be a blessing that she did not live to know of their divorce. That winter, the Princess Royale suffered from a particularly heavy cold, but on the 28th of March, 1965, was a day of unexpectedly warm sunshine at Harewood, and she suggested a walk to Harewood, and two of her grandsons, James and Jeremy, they took the familiar path past the stables and had come in sight of the lake when the princess murmured, "I feel rather dizzy." And suddenly the world and its duties and problems all slipped away. It was 12 years to the very week since her mother had died. And that's the end. 12 years to the very week that, it says here 28 March. Her burial was the 1st of April. So, 12 years to the very week that Queen Mary died. So that is the end of Mary. I mean, that is something. That is a life right there. So she lived to see so much. And she was a good sister to all of her brothers. Born smack in the middle of two older brothers and two younger brothers. So what a mentor for Princess Anne. So, and I'm going to end it right there because it's an amazing story to just take time and relish it. So, again, you can find this very pleasant read on Audible if you have a subscription, The Princess Royale, and it covers everyone. And we're about to delve much deeper into the third of the book, which talks about Princess Anne, and she's had done a lot. She puts everybody to shame, so